The Pacific War was not simply a clash of armies, it was a collision of worldviews. In Japan of the 1930s and 40s, the Imperial General Staff revived the ancient warrior ethos of Bushidō, bending it into a weapon of discipline and control. Soldiers were told again and again that surrender was unthinkable. To fall into enemy hands was not only a disgrace to the uniform, but a permanent stain upon one's family line. Death before capture was drilled into recruits with a fanaticism that left little room for doubt. On the other side of the ocean, American forces prepared for war with a very different philosophy. For them, survival was not cowardice, but strategy. A captured soldier might one day return in a prisoner exchange, or simply live to bear witness. This difference in mentality would shape one of the strangest and most revealing stories of the entire conflict. By mid-1944, the tide had turned. The fall of Saipan was a catastrophe for Japan, tearing open the inner defensive ring and bringing U.S. bombers within striking distance of the home islands. Later battles, Iwo Jima in February 1945 and Okinawa in the spring, were even bloodier. In these campaigns, Americans witnessed the ferocity of an enemy willing to fight to the last cartridge, the last grenade, even the last man. Yet, in caves and ravines, among the dead and the dying, small groups of Japanese soldiers began to do the unthinkable. They laid down their weapons. The numbers were tiny compared to Europe, where hundreds of thousands of Germans surrendered to U.S. forces. Only around 21,000 Japanese became prisoners by war's end. But each capture was extraordinary, a rupture in the logic of total war. The moment of surrender was often tinged with disbelief. Japanese soldiers expected torture, mutilation, or execution. Instead, they found cigarettes pressed into their hands, bandages for their wounds, and food rations far richer than anything they had seen in months. For men who had marched through jungles on half-rotted rice or held out in volcanic caves without water, stepping into an American camp was like stepping onto another planet. One POW would later recall that the first thing he saw on arriving in Hawaii was a group of Marines playing baseball. To him, it seemed surreal, almost impossible, that men at war could laugh, compete, and live as though peace had never left the earth. This was the beginning of a paradox. Japanese soldiers who had been told that capture was worse than death were now discovering that captivity might in fact mean survival, and perhaps even something more. For Japanese prisoners, the first days inside American camps were marked by astonishment. The barbed wire, the guard towers, the strict routines, these were expected. What came as a shock was everything else. 3 full meals a day, bread that was soft and white, butter and coffee, even the occasional fruit. Compared to the meager rations of the Imperial Army, where moldy rice or millet gruel often had to sustain entire units, the abundance seemed dreamlike. Many would later describe the camps with a phrase almost unbelievable for men once sworn to fight to the death: paradise on earth. The American approach to prisoner management was rooted in both law and strategy. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required humane treatment, but beyond that, U.S. officials recognized a powerful propaganda weapon. If Japanese soldiers returned home with stories of decent treatment, it could undermine the ferocious propaganda that painted Americans as monsters. And so, while Allied POWs starved on the Burma Railway or collapsed under beatings in Changi Prison, Japanese soldiers in the U.S. found themselves offered opportunities to learn English, to attend classes, even to work in the fields of the American Midwest. These work programs created strange juxtapositions. In Colorado and Idaho, men who had once fought at Guadalcanal now harvested sugar beets. In Texas, former Imperial soldiers picked cotton under the watch of Texan guards, who sometimes taught them songs or showed them photographs of family.
Small wages were paid, which the prisoners used to buy cigarettes, candy, or toiletries at camp canteens. What began as simple labor turned into a human encounter, awkward at first, then unexpectedly warm. Cultural bridges sprouted in unlikely places. Guards became curious about Japanese writing and calligraphy. Prisoners marveled at American music played on radios and recreation halls. Baseball, Japan's pre-war obsession, became a shared language. Matches between prisoners and U.S. guards drew crowds and laughter, momentarily dissolving the lines between enemy and captor. For some POWs, hearing Christian hymns sung in camp chapels was a revelation, soothing, melodic, worlds apart from the rigid martial chants of their training. And yet always, there was a shadow. Prisoners could not forget that while they enjoyed relative safety, civilians in Tokyo, Osaka, and Hiroshima were enduring air raids, hunger, and destruction. Letters from home when they arrived spoke of hardship, of families scraping by with ration cards, of entire neighborhoods turned to ash. The contrast weighed heavily on men who had expected torment and instead found comfort. The irony was impossible to ignore. While their own nation subjected Allied prisoners to starvation, beatings, and forced marches, Japanese soldiers in American hands discovered dignity and even a measure of humanity. It was an inversion of wartime expectations so profound that decades later, survivors still spoke of it with disbelief.
When the war finally ended in August 1945, after the flames of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the solemn surrender aboard the USS Missouri, Japanese prisoners of war faced a new, more personal battle. They had survived. That alone set them apart in a nation where survival often carried a bitter aftertaste of shame. The return journey from American camps was bittersweet. Some prisoners begged to stay, fearful of what awaited them back home. For years, Japanese propaganda had declared that captured soldiers were traitors, cowards, men who had stained their ancestors' honor. Now these same men had to step back into a society devastated by war, where entire families had been reduced to rubble and hunger gnawed at daily life. To admit that they had spent the final months of the conflict well-fed, clothed, and protected in American custody felt unbearable. Many concealed their experiences. They avoided speaking of the paradise they had known, and instead sank into silence. At local shrines, when families honored the dead, returning POWs often stood apart, sensing that they did not belong among the martyrs. Neighbors whispered, employers hesitated, and sometimes even relatives struggled to accept them. To survive in captivity was not celebrated, it was a stigma. And yet, the truth could not be entirely buried. Some former prisoners carried back new ideas, tiny seeds planted behind the wire. They had learned English, read American books, absorbed the rhythms of jazz or Christian hymns. A few returned determined to rebuild Japan with these new perspectives, choosing careers as teachers, writers, or businessmen. But many more retreated into quiet lives haunted by guilt for comrades who had chosen death in caves on Saipan or suicide charges on Okinawa rather than face the dishonor of surrender. The shadows of captivity stretched long into the post-war decades. For some, they never fully faded. Even as Japan remade itself into a modern democracy, the ex-POWs remained on the margins of memory. Men caught between survival and shame, between gratitude for unexpected kindness and the unyielding weight of their homeland's values.
As decades passed, the memories of Japanese prisoners of war in American hands acquired the weight of history. What had once been a source of shame, too painful to recount openly, slowly transformed into testimony, preserved in memoirs, interviews, and documentaries. Their voices, though few in number, carried a resonance that challenged wartime myths and reshaped post-war understanding. Historians note the scale. Nearly 400,000 German POWs were held in the United States, but only about 21,000 Japanese. Yet in many ways, the Japanese accounts proved more startling. For men raised to expect barbarity, the discovery of humane treatment became a revelation. They described Coca-Cola and canned peaches with the awe of men encountering civilization anew. They spoke of baseball games under the American sun, of libraries stocked with books they had never imagined, of guards who, though enemies, treated them with a measure of respect. Against the backdrop of Japan's own brutal handling of Allied prisoners, this stood as a staggering inversion of wartime morality. By the 1970s and 80s, some former prisoners began to break their silence. Elderly now, they recalled their captors not as demons, but as young men much like themselves. In one televised interview, a former infantryman chuckled as he remembered learning English from an American guard who taught him the phrase, "Don't worry, be happy." Others described the sense of safety they felt for the first time since leaving home, comparing the camps to an unlikely sanctuary amid the chaos of war. Their testimonies did more than preserve memory. They helped bridge two nations once locked in mortal combat. As Japan and the United States forged a close alliance during the Cold War, the stories of humane treatment became part of a broader narrative of reconciliation. They suggested that even in the darkest chapters of history, compassion could survive, and that enemies could one day look back not only with bitterness, but also with recognition of shared humanity. The legacy of these experiences endures. Museums in both Japan and the US preserve records of camp life, while scholars continue to explore what these accounts reveal about war, propaganda, and cultural difference. For descendants of the prisoners, the memories are often bittersweet. Pride in survival mixed with awareness of the stigma their fathers once carried. In the end, the story of Japanese prisoners in American camps is not just about captivity. It is about paradox. Men trained to fight to the death, finding life behind barbed wire. Soldiers expecting hell, discovering instead a fleeting vision of paradise. Their experiences remind us that war, though merciless, can sometimes reveal unexpected glimpses of humanity, moments that outlast the roar of battle and echo across generations.